I got to say continue, yeah.
Hello, or moin, as we say here in northern Germany, and welcome. My name is John Goodyear, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the fourth instalment of Globe Going Digital. So in today's instalment, we are going to interview Christopher Green in Salisbury in Wiltshire. Now, back in the mid-1950s, Christopher was on active service in Oldenburg. He too also visited the Globe on the Donnerschway barracks, or as he recalls it, the Flak-Kaserne. The Globe, of course, a British Army cinema built to entertain troops stationed here in the mid-1950s, and also the subject matter of my own research. So welcome to you, Christopher.
Thank you, John.
Christopher, we'll start off by you telling us what your full name is and the month and year of your birth.
I'm Christopher Green. I was born in July 1936.
Thank you very much, Christopher. And in terms of your childhood, tell us a little bit about the time before you got called up for national service. So a little bit about your school, about the qualifications you did and the kinds of things you got up to in your free time.
Thank you. Yes, I was at a boarding school, which in English is known as a public school, which of course is entirely wrong because it is in fact a private school. And I went there when I was 13, and in fact I had a very happy educational life, and I learned German for the first 2 years of my school career. A very, very good German teacher called David Ems, E-M-S, I think, no, E-double-M-S. And I was interested in German because I was also rather interested in music, and I was particularly fond of Schubert and some of his songs and performers like Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and Elizabeth Schwarzkopf and so forth. And Mr. Ems made us learn an awful lot of German poetry, which staggeringly I remember, particularly fond of L. Koenig, which was a great favorite of mine, and of course a great Schubert song. And Fischer-Dieskau was one of the great interpreters of those songs. So at school I was in the Cadet Force, and that was compulsory, you had to do that. And at some stage during my Cadet Force career, they started an artillery section, which is purely fortuitous, and I thought it'd be good fun to do that. So I did that, and when I left school at 18, I then had to join the army.
Could you tell us a little bit about that joining process, Christopher? How was that done? How was that facilitated? Did you get some sort of letter or some sort of call-up? How did that work?
Well, the first thing is, after your 18th birthday, when you left school, and I was only just over 18, you got a letter requiring you to report for a medical. Mm-hmm. And to the medical was in Derby, which was the nearest town to where my parents lived. And they checked that I was medically fit, and was told that you'll be hearing from us. I did have a letter then which said, what army regiment would you like to join? And frankly, my family are completely unmilitary, and I had no idea. So I think I probably left it blank. But the next thing was a letter requiring me to report to the barracks at Oswestry in the first week of October 1954. And so then my military career started, because I got on the train from Derby to Birmingham, changed trains in Birmingham to go to Oswestry to Park Hall Camp. And
what were your first impressions of Park Hall Camp, Christopher?
It was not a particularly beautiful place. A lot of wooden buildings, which I think were called spiders, where there were various sort of sleeping quarters off a main area, and there'll be coke stoves in each one. But if you've been to a public school, it was no great hardship there. It was one of those things. But the thing that struck me at the time was that the number of young men the same age as me who had arrived at the camp and indeed on the train to the camp were very upset and crying even, because the school leaving age in those days, I'm pretty sure, was 15. And they had been out at work for the last 3 years, perhaps hadn't left home before, probably had girlfriends, this sort of thing, and they were upset at joining the army. It was no great shakes to me because all my friends had to join the army. I can do a little bit of a raconteur here. One of my friends called David was called up at the same time, and he was put in the Royal Navy, which if you come to Derbyshire, it's not quite surprising really, not Portsmouth. And he went to the basic training, and they decided he was reasonably bright, and they made him the ship's librarian and postmaster on a survey ship that was surveying the West Indies. And he spent 18 months going round and round the West Indies, had the most wonderful time. He had full use of the ship's helicopter because he was the postman, and he would take the post to wherever they were going and collect the post. He would be the last person off an island as well. So he can tell you some wonderful stories, but that's completely different, a different thing. So there I was at Park Hall Camp, and we do the basic Royal Artillery training, which of course I didn't know about because I'd done it in my school Cadet Force. So I had a particularly easy time. Then you go through various tests. There's a unit selection board and a war office selection board to see if you're fit to become an officer. And I can remember that the tester at Oswestry said to me, you ought to fail the WASB on purpose because you can come back here and you can be a sergeant tester and it's a wonderful life. But I looked at him, he was at least 6 months older than me, but I didn't want to do that.
Could you tell us a little bit about these ranks and regiments there in Oswestry? So which regiment were you attached to, either there at Oswestry or eventually, Christopher, when you finally made your way to
I forget the number of the training regiment at Oswestry. It's neither here nor there. You did 2 weeks in one particular training bit, and then you were shunted off for about 3 months into another one. But I think, as far as I know, it was all the same regiment, but it might not have been. Then, as I did pass these selection boards, I went to Aldershot, what was called Mons Officer Cadet School, and we all trained there. I was with a group of about, 100, all in the Royal Artillery, and we got on fine. Towards the end of our period at Aldershot, the powers that be decided that about 7 of us would not be field gunners, which is what we had trained on, but that we were going to become light attack gunners, or flak. And we were all going to be posted to the same regiment. So, and in due course we were. Joined 72 Light Attack Regiment, which was on its way to Oldenburg. But on its way to is important because it was regrouping in Folkestone, Shorncliffe Barracks. And we all arrived there at the same time. I can't remember if there were 6 or 7 of us, but it is important that you know that we were all friends. And that made it quite difficult for the regiment. I joined a battery, which was number 42 Battery Royal Artillery, which had been in Hong Kong. There was another battery in the regiment, 91, and another one, I think, 44. And we were all, it was all imposed into this new regiment. And there was, of course, the other part of the regiment was the headquarters part, which would have all the staff, the quartermasters, the regimental sergeant major, the colonel, the adjutant, the signals people, the pay office, and all the other hangers-on that every regiment has to have. So we gathered together in Shorncliffe, and I was sent on, because I could ride a motorcycle, my battery commander made me drive to various odd places looking for the battery silver, which he was sure was in a bank, the Westminster Bank in Gravesend, or I think one, I can't remember where the other one was, but I went to each bank and they denied all knowledge of the silver. But eventually we transshipped to Oldenburg, and we took the train from Liverpool Street, got off at Harwich or Parkstone Quay, to be accurate. We got on a ship called the Parkston, and it was an overnight crossing to Holland, to the Hook of Holland, the whole regiment, well, 90% of the regiment, I should think. And then when we got to the Hook in the morning, we got on a train. Now, I've done a little bit of research because the BAOR trains had colour schemes, and I'm fairly sure ours was blue. And it went through Holland, of course, then via Osnabrück to Oldenburg. And we got off at Oldenburg. Now, you had mentioned to me, did we drive or did whatever, how did we get to the barracks? And my feeling is that we probably marched. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be that far from the station to the barracks. I mean, I do recall it was easily walkable, so we could have marched it without difficulty. And I think we would probably march up in batteries, or possibly even in troops, because there were 2 troops in each battery. And we got to the barracks, and of course they were fantastically lovely. I mean, none of the soldiers had seen anything so good. Beautifully heated, solidly built barracks. And we arrived at the main gate, and there was the barrack square in front of us, and you would turn right. The officers' mess would be fairly soon on the right, and just beyond that was the junior officers' sleeping quarters. Now, many of the senior officers could have married quarters anyway, and some of the senior ranks of the men, that was the non-officers, they would have sleeping quarters, married quarters somewhere else. So there we were in the fair city of Oldenburg.
Chris, that's lovely. Now, for our German audience who might not be aware of regimental makeup, could you just sort of outline how the regiment was made up? You talk of a unit, you talk of batteries, you obviously talk of soldiers, some of whom are actually regular army soldiers, some of whom are national service personnel. How would you define the regimental makeup for our German listeners and watchers?
Yes. Well, it was the basic regimental system, which I think still pertains to this day. We have, as I said before, the regimental headquarters, which would be the administration and the powerhouse of the regiment. Then there were the 3 separate batteries, each commanded by a major. The colonel, the commanding officer, was a lieutenant colonel, just slightly lower than a colonel. The battery commander would be a major, and he would have a second in command, and he would have 2 troops under his command, each in turn commanded by a young officer, possibly a lieutenant, but more likely a captain. And he would have somebody like me as his second in command. And mine was Captain Wheatcroft, I remember well, and the battery commander was Major Elmsley, who had fought in World War II. And he was an eccentric gentleman, very nice to me. I know for a fact that I learned early on that his breakfast consisted of pink gin. Maybe your German listeners won't know what a pink gin is, but you can explain. So we settled into our barracks, and it was a fairly routine thing that we'd all come to expect. The batteries would go off on a normal day. The batteries would do their own things. They might have drills, marching around left, right, and all that sort of thing. They would also be exercises with their guns, the 40mm Bofors, which we had, and cleaning and maintaining the guns. Everything was being done to keep the men occupied so that they weren't bored. The army has a great preoccupation about the men getting bored, because if they get bored, they do silly things.
Christopher, I have a few photos of your time in Oldenburg, which you're going to share with the audience. And here's the first photo. Could you just tell us the background behind this photo, when it was taken, perhaps who's in the photo, anything you can remember?
I remember that occasion very well because, as I will tell you later, I was garrison orderly officer. And so they were going on an exercise, a week-long exercise, and the batteries were lined up on the barrack square, as you can see. I'm standing by the gates where I took the photograph. There is a jeep to the right, which has probably got an officer in it. The leading vehicle in the middle of the picture has got an officer sticking up out of the top. And I'm pretty sure that was called the control vehicle. And I know who it was because I got another photograph of him. He was Second Lieutenant Jock Allen, who was a particular chum of mine. And there'll be another battery in the left-hand side doing the similar kind of maneuver. And on the left, as you look at that picture, were the men's quarters. And just out of shot on the left-hand side was the sergeant's mess, which is also in the barrack square.
And what about the building right at the very back there, Christopher? Do you know what the purpose of that building was?
You know, I can't remember what that building was.
It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Let's move on to the next photo. We've got another photo here. Do you know where this was taken?
Yes, this was taken in the near the gun sheds, and those are the guns of my troop. There are 4 40mm Bofors there, and they would be. I'm not sure whether they'd just been on an exercise. It looks like they had because of the dirty tires on the thing. And on the left is a sort of limber thing, which was a kind of secondary trailer which would go behind the tractor towing the guns. And to the left were the gun sheds. Mm-hmm. Now, I thought that building in the background was the junior officers' quarters, but I don't think it is. I think it's a private house.
Yes, there's quite clearly a fence there, isn't there, Christopher? It seems that's here. There's some sort of fence structure that could be.
Yes, that's not in the garrison grounds.
Yeah,
not terribly well guarded, of course, but there we are.
This photo.
Yes, I know that one well. That's taken from the rear of the officers' mess, where there was a fountain. Mm-hmm. That is the junior officers' quarters where we lived.
So you actually lived in there?
I lived in that building, yes.
Where did you live, Christopher? Was it on? It looks like is it a one story plus some sort of loft?
So
attic, yeah.
Yes, my room was on the other side. It looked out onto a small road which ran around the side of the barracks.
I think I was actually cycling down that road yesterday evening, to be honest, Christopher.
Is it something like Linden Alley or something? Or?
Yeah, I think it might be. Yeah. And we've got a photo here now with two gentlemen here in the centre with a big army truck to the left. What's the background behind this photo, Christopher?
Well, that is a 1-ton truck. The man with the stripes on his arms was not a Lance Bombardier, as he's pretending to be, but in fact he is Lieutenant David West. The man in between him and the truck is me, pretending to be the driver of the truck. Because it sounds so infantile now and so public school-ish, that they rather like to play practical jokes on newcomers to the regiment. And a new officer was arriving, and we would dress up like this to go and greet him from the railway station and put him in the truck driven by me. And I would drive it a bit fast, shall we say, and the military police would stop me for speeding and arrest me and him because he's commanding the truck. But of course, the military police were fake as well. It's all very pathetic, and it all ended happily, I might say, because the man, poor young man, who'd be 6 months younger than us, would be brought before the adjutant. But in fact, the adjutant was another of the young officers with flour in his hair to make him look grey. And he would give him the most fearful telling off and tell him to report to the colonel of the mess in half an hour for his dinner time. And then, of course, this poor soul will wander into the mess at dinner time and meet this dreadful bombardier and this dreadful gunner Green and the adjutant all dressed up as young officers, and he would be told a trick had been played on him. It wasn't, in hindsight, it wasn't very funny.
Was this a form of entertainment for you and for the junior officers?
I think it was, and I think the senior officers were complicit in it as well.
Oh, really? Okay, that's interesting.
Oh, yes, I'm sure they were. Oh, indeed, they have been, because he was marched into the adjutant's office, and the real adjutant must have given his permission.
Looking back at these things, Chris, you say this is quite infantile, but do you think it served a purpose, perhaps, for morale among, you know, the junior officer corps and even further
I think that might be true, that they would encourage us to be ingenious and do something slightly unusual.
Interesting. Here's the next photo.
Well, that is a group of young officers outside the officers' mess. I'm the one on the left. Next to me is a man called Spencer Holtham, who is a regular soldier. The one in the middle, I can't remember his name. The one whose only face you can see is called Derek Frost. And the one next to him is Jerry Ryan, who was the one who dressed up as the adjutant.
Okay.
And the one on the right, I think he was a REME officer called Tony Record or something. Or maybe that was the other one in the middle. Recall.
Christopher, what about their backgrounds? Did they have very similar backgrounds to you, or were they individuals from completely different social and educational backgrounds?
No, they were largely the same, I would have thought. Largely the same. I mean, Jerry Ryan, the second from the right, was already a barrister. So he was an old man of about 22.
Okay.
Frost, the one whose face you can see, was a particularly good athlete. I can't say much for the other three.
But presumably, they're obviously doing their national service with the exception of the gentleman signed up.
Second from the left, he was a regular soldier.
Mm-hmm. And how long would they have been in Oldenburg? Would it have been sort of fairly similar to the amount of time that you were there, or very different?
I think we got there in about August 1955, and I suspect that this photograph was taken probably May 56. We would have been there for quite a few months by then.
Okay. And what were your dates in Oldenburg, Christopher?
Mm-hmm.
What were your dates in Oldenburg, Christopher?
My dates?
Yeah.
Well, same from August 55 until September 56.
Okay. And during that time, you told me in a previous conversation that you did a lot of travel around Germany.
Quite a bit, yeah.
And could you tell us a bit about this photo, Christopher?
Well, that was fun. We went to Berlin in early 1956 by train, I think from Hanover, in a sealed train through the East Germany, and we were led by a full colonel who was from the 5th Army Group Royal Artillery, 5 Agra, as we called it. And he was a full colonel has red tabs on his shoulders and on his collar and so on. And he, for reasons of his own, wanted to go to Berlin to go around the nightclubs. And his only reason, the only way he could get there was by pretending to take a football team there. And he managed to get 10 of us together, and we all went off for one night in Berlin. And we were to play the Cheshire Regiment, and the politics of the whole thing required us to report to the Cheshire Regiment to say we were there to play football and to have a drink with them and then leave, which is what we did. And the colonel took us round all the seediest nightclubs in Berlin that you could possibly imagine. My parents would have been horrified. And I'd be horrified if one of my grandchildren did that now. But, it could be quite seedy in those days. We went all around the Russian sector and Treptower Park and by the Reichstag, which of course is near the Brandenburg Gate where this photograph was taken. And I've got another photograph of one of our colleagues who at the same, I took his photograph and he took mine. And it was an eye-opener to go into East Berlin and see the Soviet tower blocks which are being built. And they're probably still there today, I don't know. But they were pretty ominous looking, shall we say. Great grey blocks in Lenin Alley, and I'm sure there was a Stalin Alley.
Yeah. Do you remember anything else of your time there, Christopher, in the Eastern sector, so the Soviet sector?
No, I never went into the Soviet sector at all, apart from that trip through.
Okay. Coming back to Berlin, you spent just one night. You went down, you went into these nightclubs, and then you returned back to Oldenburg. How did you get back to Oldenburg? The same way you came?
By train, yes. We had sort of digs in. We stayed in a private house. Is there a suburb of Berlin called Charlottenlund or Charlottenburg? Schulenburg, yeah, that's where we stayed. And they had a small boy who had a big sort of wooden trolley or pram, converted pram. And I can remember him taking all our bags to the station for us. Not that we had much baggage, I must say.
Coming back to Oldenburg, Christopher. Coming back to Oldenburg, Christopher, could you describe, what would be your typical day on barracks? What would you have to do? What were your duties? What were your tasks? What were your roles and responsibilities?
Well, ordinarily, I would get my troop to do what the troop commander wanted to be done, or the battery commander wanted to be done, or even more, what the colonel wanted to be done. And we would have a set routine about drills and preparing the guns and so forth. We would sometimes go on small sort of day-long exercises onto the heath nearby to practice taking the guns out and setting them up, on open space, not in the barracks, and pretending to shoot at aircraft, that kind of thing. Then we had no live ammunition ever, except when we went to the firing camp in Todendorf. But that was a proper trip to Todendorf. So that was our day, and as a young officer, you would sometimes be the orderly officer, which would be a routine job which you do about once every 2 or 3 weeks, where you would have to inspect the guard at the guardhouse and make sure that any prisoners in the guardhouse were properly accommodated and being looked after. You would go around the various men's quarters to make sure things were all right. And I'm fairly sure, thinking about it now, you would probably also go to the Globe just to make sure everything was okay. And then finally, towards the end of the evening, you would call in at the sergeant's mess, and they would do their very best to get you drunk. And sometimes they succeeded, and sometimes they didn't. But the sergeants were very friendly to us young officers. And as I said, they realized that there was a certain camaraderie amongst us because we were friends from officer cadet school. And they didn't try to break it up at all. They, in fact, I think, humored us in some ways. And I think some of those men that I had under my command actually told me how to deal with things much better than I would have been able to without their advice. They were decent, sensible men.
It's an interesting observation there, Christopher. So you had this this entertainment among your junior officer corps. Were there any things that you did outside of the barracks before we sort of turned to the Globe? In terms of entertainment, what did you do?
Well, as you realise, I had a smattering of German. I could speak quite reasonable German in those days. And at least one of the other officers, called John Gibbs, could speak German. And indeed, he had bought an old German Ford Taunus. And in 1955, it was a pretty awful car, but it took us around. Now, we would usually go into Oldenburg itself to have coffee or a beer or whatever, and we preferred to go into town rather than use the army. Well, it wouldn't be done for us to go to the NAFI, really. It would be the wrong thing for a young officer to do. And we would go back to have dinner in the mess normally. Well, that wasn't compulsory, but you would do that. So we were much more independently minded than most young officers because A, some of us could speak a certain amount of German, and B, we were all friends. And we had nothing but pleasant experiences in Oldenburg itself. There was never any kind of, well, not to our knowledge, no nastiness. We all had the nicest feelings for the town and its inhabitants.
Talking of inhabitants, Christopher, did you actually meet up and get friendly with any local German people? Can you remember that?
Not really, no. I remember that there were a number of drivers who had Volkswagen cars, painted khaki, which were part regimental use. And there was a very friendly driver called Heinz, who we all often used, but I don't know his surname. I've got no photographs of him. And we didn't go to the theatre or cinema in Oldenburg itself, although we did go to the odd dance at the Weser Emshalle, particularly at Fasching. I remember that one. That was a riotous evening. We all knew something was likely to happen of excitement, and it was very jolly. And nobody seemed to resent some young English officers being there.
Were you wearing your uniform, Christopher, or were you wearing civvies?
No, but we were pretty obviously not German. You know, the sort of thing, we'd be wearing flannels and Harris tweed jackets.
That's probably where the stereotype comes from, Christopher. You did very much to form a stereotype that exists even to this very day in Oldenburg.
I know. I look at them here and I think, you're bloody idiots.
Christopher, you mentioned something in our previous conversation about a pub experience that you had when you went out drinking, and that there were some bars that were off limits. Could you tell the audience a bit about that? Well,
it was very strange. We were behaving ourselves perfectly well, and we went into a pub, and one of our team said, I think this place is out of bounds and we shouldn't be in here. But some of us did go in, and we were not so much arrested as surprised by RAF military police who came in their blue uniforms and white caps, and they reported us to the regiment. Now, one or two of the officers who were in this group were actually not in 7-2, my regiment, but in the neighbouring one, 4-4 Heavy Ack. But there were two of us in 7-2, and we were up before the colonel the next morning, and he was furious with us because we let the side down. The RAF police, we shouldn't, they're dreadful people, they shouldn't be arresting my young officers. And as a punishment, you are both going to be garrison orderly officers for the next week. You'll have to do all the duties that the garrison orderly officer has to do. Well, that was the week when the first photograph showed our battery setting off on an exercise. So they all went away for a week. And David West and I were left in the barracks on our own, doing the various duties of the garrison orderly officer, which are minimal. But one of the duties was to go every day to the Globe Cinema Theatre to make sure it was all right. And of course, it was operating perfectly well. And the clientele, whilst we were away, whilst the regiment was away, were the wives and the children and so forth. I don't think our duty was anything particular to do with the theatre or the cinema, but simply to go there and make sure that there were no complaints about behaviour or anything like that. So we had a very pleasant week, and we took motorbikes out of the motorbike stores, and we rode them around the training areas and had a fine old time. It's a silly thing, but there we are.
Going back to the globe, Christopher, this is obviously the subject matter of the research. I was even there last night, to tell you the truth.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I saw the building at first hand again. Could you give us your recollections of what you remember about the globe, the building, or the people who worked there, or how you bought tickets, anything of that nature?
Well, I wish I could help you in depth, but I can't. I remember it was a very smart building, obviously quite new, and I think you have told me that it probably had just opened, but I didn't know that. And I did attend cinema there on a number of occasions when I was off duty, of course, and just going to the pictures, as we used to say in those days. You have to remember, of course, that there were no televisions around in these days. I mean, I don't suppose there was much television in Germany, and there was certainly very little in Britain. And it only come to the Midlands. University of Birmingham will tell you this. At the time of the Queen's coronation in '53, only a very few people could afford a television set, or even afford to rent one, which was the common thing through radio rentals. And so the cinema was huge in people's private lives, both in the army in Germany and at home. And I can remember seeing, I'm sure I saw Carmen Jones, which I had actually seen before in Aldershot, but I was so taken by the lively music and the way it had been done. I thought it was just so clever. I saw it 3 or 4 times that year, so I might have gone more than once in that week to the Globe. I was also rather taken by Dorothy Dandridge, who was this female star, who didn't sing, in fact. Her singing was done by the great Marilyn Horne, but anyway, there we go. The other films we would have seen would have been the classic kind of Ealing comedies or American thriller things, but nothing that left a mark on me. Though I no doubt enjoyed them at the time.
Was the building used for any other purposes, Christopher? Not just cinema, but for anything else, can you recall?
I don't recall that, although of course it could have been used as a kind of lecture theatre, but I only say that it could have been. Did it actually belong to the garrison, or did it belong to the Army AKC, or whatever it was called?
Yeah, it's the AKC cinema. Yeah, it's an AKC cinema.
And I don't remember where we had there must have been places for lectures in the barracks. I know we would have had talks in the officers' mess, but that's not quite the same thing, because there'd only be about 30 or 40 people there. But if you had a talk to the whole battery, maybe it was done in open air on the barrack square. I don't know. I can't remember.
How many people would we be talking about here, Christopher, for the entire battery? So what numbers are we talking about of people living on the site? Or yes, on the battery, but people living on the site?
Well, the battery would be, I'm guessing now, 200 people. And there were 3 batteries, and there was the headquarters department. So there were several hundred people in the regiment. Under 1,000, I should think. But then attached to the gunners were the pay corps, the RENI, the signals, the engineers, all engineers. So there were all sorts of other little departments added on. And their officers would all use our officers' mess.
Talking about other forms of occupation during your downtime, let's say. Obviously, there's the entertainment side of things, but there's also the sport side of things. Could you elaborate on how important sport would have been and what sort of sports were done?
Hugely important. The regiment, again, it's this business of preventing boredom. Dorothy Parker had a good saying about this. She said, the cure for boredom is curiosity, and there's no cure for curiosity. So we were curious to try new things. Hockey was a huge success because my regiment had played in Hong Kong, and we played on the barrack square where you saw those vehicles lining up, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. The regiment itself had a good hockey team, and we played in the British Army finals of Germany, and we lost, which was a great disappointment to the colonel and everybody concerned. There was soccer as well. Most of the men played soccer, although for 2 Battery, most of the men wanted to play hockey. There was cricket. There were all sorts of funny little cricket teams going on, and I was roped in to play with the pay office cricket team because I was the pay officer for a couple of months or so in the summer. The winter of 1956 was incredibly cold. We were comfortable there in our barracks, but the colonel decided that we would all go skating, and we skated on the fenlands to the north of Oldenburg. And we would just drive out there in 3-ton trucks, clip the skates onto our army boots, and just set off across the fens. It was great fun. And it kept men occupied, because things like the barrack square would be very icy. So if you were doing drill, people get injured or fall over and break a leg or something. So we were doing that. And athletics was a very important thing. In the summer, there was, I can't remember quite where the athletics fields were, but they were marked out with 100 meters and 400 meters, or perhaps it was 100 yards and 440 yards, I can't remember. The shot put circle and all these things. And it was an inter-battery contest. And I'd mentioned this chap, Derek Frost, who was one of the young soldiers, officers. He was a particularly good runner and an all-round sportsman. He could play anything. And he won all the prizes, as I recall. So, you know, it was skating, hockey, cricket, athletics, soccer. I don't recall rugby football. I don't recall that. But it was one of the great things to keep the men occupied.
Yeah. Of course. Talking of keeping them occupied, of course, travel and moving troops around is something that is the hallmark of any soldiers or officers' life in the army. You talked about Tordendorf earlier on, Christopher, about the training that you did. Could you just elaborate a bit more on what that entailed exactly and how it was organised and what you did up in Tordendorf?
Yeah, it was the same thing as when they went off on that exercise that I didn't go on. We would just go down the Autobahn, past Bremen, past Hamburg, up towards Lübeck, and then up through Schleswig-Holstein to Tordendorf. And it was the whole regiment, all the guns. And I can't remember what the quarters were like there, but it didn't really matter. We had a very interesting time, and the batteries would take it in turns to fire at a drogue towed behind a de Havilland Mosquito, which went back and forth with this drogue about 1 kilometre behind it. And luckily nobody was tempted to shoot at the aircraft. There were the odd sort of rival comments, like I could get that one if I wanted to, sort of thing. But and you just fired away at this drogue. And some people actually managed to hit it. We were also trained to fire at cardboard tanks, using the Luftwaffe's gun as a weapon in land warfare. They had some sort of cardboard tanks that they would drag out of the pine trees, and with the gun at low level, you shoot at them. Of course, that was dead easy. They all love shooting at these important things because it was only sort of 400 meters away and you couldn't miss. It wasn't flying at 300 miles an hour. So, and we shared the camp with some Americans who were obviously doing a similar exercise, so not with us, but we got talking to the American officers, and we were amazed by how involved the young officers were. Our equivalents were in the technical sense that they knew how the radar worked, they knew how the range defining machines all worked and so forth, whereas we didn't. We had engineers who did all that. but we were disappointed to see how little care they took of their own men, which the British Army has always been adamant. You know, an officer can't go back to the officer's mess until he's made sure all the men have had a shower and got their boots off and had some food. Then the officer can go back. And the Americans thought we were balmy. And that was wholly reciprocated. And is to this day, I should think.
Christopher, let's talk a little bit about the differences. Obviously, you're a junior officer. What were the differences between, or notable differences between you and some of the regular soldiers that would have just been sort of drafted in for national service as a gunner? Were there notable differences there?
Well, there were, but in fact, it is possible that some of them hated it, and they wish they were back home in Birmingham or wherever, and you know, with their girlfriends or whatever. But in fact, I think ultimately the ordinary soldiers who had not had the privileges that I had had grew to enjoy their army career, because the sense of actually doing something as a team and doing it right and having a bit of fun at the same time. And they learned skills that they would never have learned if they were working, you know, as a hall porter in Sainsbury's or something. So they were learning about gunnery, and I think most of them did appreciate that in the end. They also appreciated the fact that we were in Germany, which was what they would call a cushy number. Because there was always a danger that you could have been posted to Malaya, where there had been a communist uprising, or Cyprus, where Ioka was around. Korea was just about over by then, and quite a few national servicemen were killed, you know, in these various conflicts that happened. And of course, some were killed immediately, nothing to do with me, immediately after I left the army. There was the Suez crisis, where national servicemen had to stay on in the army because they wouldn't be released, because they might have been needed. So I think I go back on some of them who actually had a very interesting time and made the most of it. And of course, you don't get too friendly with them, so you don't really know what they're thinking. But
what was the point of it, Christopher? What was the point of national service, in your opinion? What was it in aid of? What was it for?
Well, did you know, I recall that, in fact, once World War II was over, the whole idea was to get the soldiers home and people who had been called up during the war, and in some of the older soldiers, to get rid of them and so on. But then, you know, the British, with their terrible optimism, thinking that they still wanted to rule the globe, found that they needed men on the ground all over the place, like the ones I mentioned. Obviously, Germany was one, because it was the Soviet Union was the great threat. But there was Cyprus, there was Egypt, and there was Libya, I think, I seem to remember. Singapore was considered to be a great posting, provided you didn't have to fight anybody. Hong Kong, wonderful posting, but there's a danger was if you go to Hong Kong, you might end up in Korea. And I think, I mean, sort of getting back to the theme of this, some troops had to be in Japan. So I know that the Attlee government suddenly realized in the late 1940s that all their wonderful schemes for bettering people's lots of health service, legal aid, planning permissions and so forth, which are all wonderful, they eventually realized, or they were told by the Ministry of Defense or the War Office, that they didn't have enough men. And Clement Attlee struggled to pass an act in 1949 reintroducing national service. Not many people know that.
No.
And it was brought back for 18 months. And it was over the dead bodies of a number of Labour MPs who didn't approve of it. But it was passed. And it was 18 months until about 1950 or 51 when it was made 2 years. Mm-hmm. I think the last man left national service in 1960 or 61. But it was well established as 2 years in my time. And it was, I don't suppose I think another reason was that until the partition of India and the independence of India, the British government would always rely on Indian troops being brought in. And then, of course, but India wouldn't have any of that after 1947. That was another big reason.
How was it seen, Christopher, national service? What was the perception of national service among the service personnel who worked there, who were drafted in, or even the soldiers, the regular soldiers who looked on at these national service men?
I think to start with, the regular soldiers didn't really approve of them very much, but they grew to understand that some of these young men, and I'm not talking about officers, some of these young men were quite bright and were quite capable of doing a very good job. And some of those young men wanted to do a good job. So it wasn't awful. There were always a number who were completely hopeless, illiterate, and so on. But in fact, because the artillery is a technical corps, the really stupid ones didn't get drafted into the Royal Artillery.
Oh, that's interesting.
They would go into some... You see, the army has its own snobberies, you see. I mean, there used to be something called the Pioneer Corps. Well, the Pioneer Corps were the people who had to go and dig latrines, because that's all they could do. And, you know, there we are. And the people like the Royal Engineers and REME, which is the electrical and mechanical engineers, and the signals, all the ones who joined them and the Royal Artillery would have had a reasonable educational standard. So, to some extent, the gunners were lucky that they had some decent ones. I mean, we had some idiots. I mean, we had an attempted murder in my troop, which was just absolutely ridiculous. Two of the national servicemen having a fight, and one tried to kill the other one, and he was court-martialed and went to jail.
So you had some sort of severe misdemeanors, and they were punished accordingly.
That was the only severe one I can recall. The rest was ones like having a dirty rifle on parade and so on, you know. Or a young officer not having had his hair cut, like mine.
Where did you get your hair cut, Christopher? Where was that? Was that done on barracks?
And there was a regimental barber.
Okay.
Remember the regimental sergeant major, who would always be the most fearsome of creatures, but in fact usually a gentle giant, would come up to an officer like me and say, "Mr. Green, sir, your hair is a little long, is it not?" You know, and you say, "Oh, Sergeant Major, isn't that long?"
There's something comical about this, Christopher, isn't there? And this is something that's picked up in British comedy, as particularly at the end of the 50s. What's your take on that? What's your take on that?
Like that, and there were some comic misfits. Sadly, I mean, I can remember in our basic training in Oswald Street, we had a very elegant, very well-known young man from a very well-known family. Everybody knew who he was. And he couldn't put one foot in front of the other without falling over. He was quite clever, but if you asked him to march left, right, his arms would be out of sync with his feet, and you just wonder how the hell did the army cope with that? And eventually they're tolerant. I can speak from personal knowledge. I know of somebody who was called up the year before me and went to Catterick, the garrison, for this basic training, and he hated it, and he ran away. He got home, his parents rang up the regiment and said, "Our John is home," and they came and took him. He ran away 3 times. Oh, no. And the army discharged him on psychological grounds, and he ended up having a rather good career in broadcasting. But it shows the army didn't throw the book at him. And I mean, he actually is a relative of mine, so I promise you, I can't possibly name him.
No, of course not. You don't have to name him.
But then he ran away 3 times, and each time the military police came and took him back to Catterick, and eventually his parents went and picked him up and brought him home, and he went and got a job. So the army wasn't this sort of awful machine. It did have its moments of sympathy and understanding.
That's a very interesting take on it, Christopher. One that's actually quite rare to hear, but it's an interesting take on it.
Yes, but anyway, our officers, the senior officers, the regular officers, were quite decent to us, the young National Service officers, because for all the fun that we had and the naughtiness we did actually do our jobs. We did as well as we could, and as well as they could as well. I've told you before that the sergeants, who had vastly more experience than the captains and the majors, were even more tolerant. The ones who were a little bit tricky were the young regular soldiers who wanted to get on in the army and didn't particularly like having an 18-year-old public school boy telling them what to do. For all my sins, I was actually, you showed a picture of that one-ton truck thing, I actually taught some of them to drive. And I can remember coming around that corner by the junior officers' quarters where you were cycling yesterday on packed ice in this one-ton truck. I was driving, and the chap I was instructing was sitting next to me, and the truck was all over the road. As we went round the right-hand bend, he started shrieking, "We're sliding, we're sliding." And I said, "I know, Gunno, applying full opposite lock, I know we're sliding." At all of 10 miles an hour.
Fabulous stories.
He was promoted to Lance Bombardier on the strength of that. His name was Tag.
Say again?
His surname was Tag, T-E-G-G. Rather Dickensian name, really.
Yeah. Christopher, we're coming to the end of our interview now, and obviously I've told you a little bit about this Globe Cinema, which is the one that you visited in Oldenburg. What do you think to the idea of it being rescued and saved and brought back to life?
I think it's a wonderful thing. I wish them every success. It's a good building, by all accounts. I've seen a photograph that you put up of it, and it would serve as a wonderful base for the town, you know, to show classic cinema and little theatrical shows and concerts. I mean, my wife and I, before we moved here, we lived in Winchester, and we used to do concerts in Winchester Cathedral and in Winchester College. And I was the chairman of this club, and my wife was the concert manager. And it's amazing how you can get people to take part in choral singing, for example, or little theatrical entertainments. And if they've got the building and they've got 1 or 2 enthusiasts, it's amazing how much it can grow into something really tangible and a huge benefit for all ages.
Yeah. So
I give it my wholehearted support, and if this talk does any good, I'm really happy.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a greater sense of what's going on the barracks site, and also what would have gone on in the building, because your interview confirmed today, Christopher, I can sort of sum up and wrap up, that obviously you went into a building where it wasn't just service personnel there, but it was also families and also children. So it was very much for everybody,
yes.
You know, living in that community there in the mid-1950s, 1955, 56, and you would have been one of the first to have actually experienced it because of the dating of the building. So yeah, fabulous stories, Christopher. Fabulous.
Well, I left out the saucy ones.
What I'll do now is I'll put up on the screen my contact details. So for those of you who are watching this, you found this particularly interesting, perhaps you even remember Christopher Green on this site of Donnerschwee, or the Flak-Kaserne, or the Krea Barracks as it was known, you're more than happy to contact me, and I can put you in touch with Christopher. So my email address is there. It's j.goodyear@BHAM, obviously for the University of Birmingham, so bham.ac.uk. And if you're interested in the Globe cinema and theatre project, bringing it back to life, the email address is there at www.globe-oldenburg.de. And if you go on there, you'll be able to see some of the other interviews that we've conducted with people like Christopher and others, with regards to their histories and what they remember of their time here in Oldenburg in the mid-1950s. So, Christopher, let me thank you wholehearted for this wonderful talk today, and for getting in contact with me. It's been wonderful, and I've learned a lot more about the Globe and about Oldenburg in the mid-1950s and how it was perceived by a junior officer such as yourself.
Well, thank you, John. I've enjoyed talking to you.
All the best. Take care.
I'm going to see the Globe sometime. Fingers crossed.
You must come and visit us. Yes, you do that, Christopher. All the best, and I shall speak to you soon.